Rabbit's stomach was in knots worrying about Shiraz and if she'd like him when he arrived, so much so that the already questionable airplane food made him very, very sick. He spent much of the flight in the lavatory, annoying the hell out of the other passengers who wanted to use it. They just couldn't understand his plight or find room in their hearts for sympathy. "Oh, this is a sign from God," he said over and over. When the plane touched down in Morocco, he, as one of his many phony identities, went through immigration with his heart in his mouth, trying to fight the urge to just drop everything and run to the nearest bathroom again. The nervousness made it all the harder to look casual while the airport official examined Michael Lappin's passport. To get into the spirit of being in a Muslim country, he had grown the kind of goatee he saw Sinbad the Sailor and cartoon Grand Viziers and genies have. Jinn, they called him here, or Jun if there was plural. He now had a little brown mustache that curved down around the corners of his lips and a fancy beard that curved inward from his bottom lip, down his chin, and up and around to point back at itself. It was a pain in the neck to shave, but worth it to him. He felt part of Morocco before he'd even got there. He felt ready. But he didn't look much like his passport photo anymore, and that held him up for a bit. Then, customs. Because he was a handsome young man, it always seemed that he stuck out in a crowd, and his bags must be checked more thoroughly than anyone else's. Sure enough, 3 women in uniform called him over with great big smiles and asked him to open his luggage. "Now, before you look in there," he said quietly, arousing their immediate suspicion, "there's a few things that I bought from my wife. All I ask is that you don't, pick 'em up and wave 'em around for everybody to see." They frowned and opened the first bag, and then their eyes lit up. There was a large dildo on top, front and center, and a couple of riding crops and a small whip. They started laughing and picking them up out of the bag. "Yeah, she's a wild one," he said sheepishly. They started pretending that they were going to call out to someone and show what they had in their hands, and he put on a look of panic and shame, whispering, "No, no, 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 no." They teased him a little more, then did a perfunctory look under his clothes, saw his 2 extendable steel fighting batons, some ninja smoke bombs, and a silenced automatic pistol he'd broken down into its smallest components and then disguised as mundane objects with which one would travel. With their attention on the toys, they didn't even notice the weapons and checked the other bags. They grinned wickedly and zipped up his suitcase for him and said, "Welcome to Morocco, lover boy." At the exit, he searched all the faces in the crowd of waiting families for the one he would recognize from photos sent by email over the past few months. And there she was. Shiraz Tufga was the second most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and that was a close second. Her face was exquisitely lovely, with hazel eyes and sensual lips, long black hair, and the most astonishing smile when she saw him looking at her. Dear God, he thought. And she wants me? The other people that were trying to leave the airport behind him pushed and grunted, and he apologized, moving forward out of their way. Shiraz laughed at his embarrassment, but not in a mocking way, rather like she was flattered. He was terrified that his nervous stomach would ruin this first impression, but he gritted his teeth and went to see her. She put out a hand for him to shake and asked him in perfect English how was the flight and blah, 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 all the small talk questions that helped cover their mutual anxiety while she led him to a small beige taxi that took them to the train. They talked of trivialities mostly, occasionally interrupting themselves to blurt out, "I can't believe this is really happening." First she said it, that she couldn't believe he'd actually come, and then he said the same thing 5 minutes or an hour later. Morocco is a country of strong and saturated colors, with wrought iron balconies over bright blue or Asila green doors that are painted to ward off evil June, and all the paint in the world could not have prevented the bad luck that struck them once they got on the train. They continued to talk about nothing while Rabbit tried to calm his nervous stomach until, half an hour into the trip, the train broke down in the middle of a desert plain. They cursed and sweated a bit and then resolved to make the most of it, listening to the other passengers complain and smiled at them, hoping that would lighten the mood. Another train came eventually to tow them back to some semblance of civilization, but after they were connected and the people had cheered when they began to move again, there was a distant screaming that no one understood at first. When it persisted, someone stood up to look out the window and he recoiled in shock, pulling his head back in and shouting. "What?" Rabbit asked Shiraz. "What is it?" "I don't know," she said. "I don't understand." Then, panic. The other passengers began screaming and grabbing their luggage, fighting each other to get to the doors. Rabbit had no choice but to sit still and be calm, because he had to go to the bathroom again, but there was no chance of getting to it. The train was in chaos, and he just sat still, and Shadaz, surprised by his calm and mistaking the reason for it, stayed put also, until she understood what they were saying. "The train is on fire!" she gasped. "You're kidding," Rabbit said wearily. She leaped out of her seat to grab his bags while he struggled to his feet, and together they wrestled with the other passengers, who seemed to be all elbows, to get to the door. At any given moment, Rabbit was sure that one of his neighbors in the aisle would jostle him into an unpleasant accident that would ruin any chance of starting something with Shadaz, ever. When they finally got out of their car's door and jumped down into the desert gravel, dragging his bags out of the way, they saw that it was the train that had come to get them that had caught fire, and everyone on the both of them was now standing outside, watching it burn. Rabbit cursed quietly under his breath, and then a pack of wild dogs showed up. Shadaz screamed, and he turned to look at them coming, all yellow fangs and blood-red mouths agape and wicked black eyes glinting in the oppressive sunlight. For Christ's sake. His only fear was that an accident now would be mistaken for him soiling his pants out of terror, and that made him hate those dogs that came running with a rage no language has an adequate word for. He dropped his bags and took off his shirt, wrapping it quickly around one forearm, and held that arm out and bent for the first dog to bite, bracing his feet wide apart. Shadaz stared at him. "What are you doing?" "Just stay behind me. Praying, please God. If I die right now, I don't care. Just don't let me crap my pants. Let me look good in front of this smoking hot girl." The first tawny, mangy dog came way too fast, and Rabbit didn't even have time to gulp before it leaped, its jaws closing on the shirt he held out for it. He felt those yellow fangs dig through the fabric into his shirt, and he swiveled his body, using its weight and momentum against it to swing it sideways. Shadaz gasped as he broke its neck with a sickening crunch. The dog fell in a heap onto the gravel and sand in between them, and Rabbit had time to open its suitcase full of weapons. Shadaz saw only the dildo, the whip, and the riding crops, and her eyes went even wider, while Rabbit searched frantically among his clothes for the two batons. In desperation, he grabbed the whip instead, rose, and shook out its coils, glaring at the rest of the dogs as they came. For some reason, maybe having seen their brother die, or maybe because they saw the fleeing people as easier targets, or the will of the gods of Africa that make wild dogs attack, some people, and not others, told them to leave Rabbit alone, but the rest of the pack ran past them and the girl they crouched behind him, in hot pursuit of the people in turbans and hijabs that ran down the length of the train with their luggage. They sagged in relief, and Rabbit turned, kissed Shadaz quickly, startling her, and handed her the whip. "Hold this for a sec." She took the whip, and he walked stiffly back into the train, hauled himself up onto it, and disappeared through the door. Shadaz stared after him, then at the dead dog next to her with its head turned at a grotesque angle, and then at the dildo. A hot wind rustled the dry bushes in her long hair, and she turned to watch the fleeing people and dogs shrink away down the length of the train. She was still in shock over the strange turn her day had taken, and Rabbit's manner of handling it all, and wasn't sure what yet to think. And what was he doing back on the train? Minutes passed, and no sign of him. Eventually, she bent down and started gathering the items that had tumbled out of his suitcase and rearranged them, and curiosity got the better of her, and she rummaged a bit through his clothes. She found both batons and the pieces of the gun he had broken down, guessing what they were. Who is this guy? She kept glancing at the dead dog that would have killed the both of them. How fearlessly and competently he had just snapped its neck as if it were nothing. She felt the burn of his lips on hers and touched them with her fingertips. And at that moment he appeared in the open doorway of the train, without his shirt, and she had to smile. He was muscular, but not muscular like Marky Mark was, who she'd been in love with the year before. More like Bruce Lee was, with no fat on his body at all, every fiber of every muscle standing out in sharp relief. Not very big, but evidently strong, and showing a serious self-discipline that she respected in a man. And those abs. She watched him hop down off the train and approach with a bit of a swagger that he hadn't had before, as if a great weight had been lifted off his shoulders and he had relaxed. She took a shirt at random from his open suitcase and tossed it to him. He smiled and caught it, wrestled his way into it, and she watched those washboard stomach ripple before it vanished. "Ready?" he asked with a contagious grin. Marrakech is a loud, bustling city of labyrinthine alleys and innumerable distractions. For a newcomer, all sense of direction goes out the window. Men in turbans sell potions that will cure everything from a broken heart to an inability to pay your rent. Snake charmers play oboes and gourd flutes and ask for money. Donkey carts careen from out of nowhere and disappear again into the crowd. Water sellers clang their castanets or bang brass cups together to add to the general din. And kamikazes on Vespas hurtle through the gaps in the crowd at breakneck speeds. Somehow, no one dies. The Gemma Efna, the main square and the open-air theater, which is like live-action channel surfing, has had myriad shows running simultaneously in unison at the same time for, according to Shiraz, 1,000 years. They arrived as the sun was going down, just in time for 100 chefs to appear with grills in tow, and musicians were tuning their instruments and preparing for an amazing show. Stools were being snagged early, but chivalry was not dead in Marrakech, as women and the elderly had rights that overruled the first-come, first-served. Rabbit thought it remarkable, because he'd heard for years how women were at the bottom of the totem pole in Muslim countries. Because of the 36 hours of travel and his unpleasant adventure earlier, the entire evening had a hazy, dreamlike sort of quality for Rabbit, but he wouldn't have had it any other way. When he looked into Shiraz's bright hazel eyes and she smiled her 1,000-watt smile at him, he was happier than he'd ever been, exhausted or not. He watched something enter her eyes at that moment, and make a small furrow appear between them, though. "What is it?" he asked, fear growing in his belly. "Why do you have those things in your suitcase?" "Oh," he laughed, the whips and the vibrator? Yes, are you into weird things like that?" He could tell she had been waiting a while before asking, and now it was the one thing that would decide whether she'd take him home or not. They'd flirted for months. He'd had in jest suggested marriage, and she'd said yes with a conviction that had startled him. And they had made all kinds of plans, but now everything hinged on this, quite suddenly. "Oh," he laughed, "don't worry. I only brought those in my luggage to distract the customs people from what I had to smuggle in. My batons." "And why do you have those batons?" Well, because sometimes a pack of wild dogs comes out of nowhere, and I don't always have time to break all their necks." Uh-oh. That was probably the wrong answer. "You don't use those whips on people? And you don't use that dildo on yourself?" "What? No!" "Honest?" she persisted. "Are you kidding? I just had to know, because if you use those things, I don't think I could take you into my house." "Don't worry, they were a ruse for customs." "Is there anything else I need to know about?" "Nothing I can think of," he said, trying that goofy grin. "I can't believe you killed that dog just like that." "Well, it would have killed us just like that, wouldn't it?" "I know, but you know what I mean." Her doubts fizzled away, and she liked him again. You have to know I am a man who can protect you." "I love the way you kissed me earlier, just like that." She snapped her fingers. There was something about it. "What, like this?" He leaned in, but she recoiled, eyes wide. "No, you cannot. We are in public in a Muslim country." "So? It's frowned upon. We cannot even hold hands." "What?" "I will explain later. Let's get into a taxi because I'm tired and I want to go home." "You're tired," he thought. "You ain't seen nothing. I'm going to collapse any minute." But he was glad he passed her little test. They found another beige compact taxi to take them into a labyrinth of narrow streets and high earthen walls until they could not go any further, and they were left with the luggage in the gathering darkness. Shiraz paid the taxi and led him through the maze, Rabbit now wishing he'd brought a ball of string to tie to a signpost and mark his way back from wherever they were going. The narrow alleys seemed with every twist and turn to take them backwards in time. The buildings were stained with the patina of antiquity, but not with the charm that Antigua Guatemala had. Here it was a less cultivated dilapidation. People up ahead of them had stepped into doorways and waited for them to pass, and there was still barely room for them to squeeze through. Eventually they came to a halt outside of a door painted a Sila green, and somehow he knew that she had painted it. From the outside, it looked like nothing special. It was just a door in a blah-covered wall, but since so many houses back in Antigua had been like that, ugly and crumbling facades that opened on spectacular gardens and colonial Moorish architecture, he expected to walk into an ugly duckling apartment that would blow him away with tasteful extravagance. Shiraz had a nervous smile as she unlocked the door and glanced back at him over her shoulder. "It isn't much, but," she said. "Don't worry, sweetie," he said. "It's home." "My humble abode." The door opened and she helped him drag his luggage into a tunnel of darkness. He didn't know where the lights were, or if there even were any. And while it felt a little strange to him, there was something appealing about it, like he had genuinely left his old life behind and gone to a different time where life was simpler. "Okay, hold down," she said, and he decided she meant to say hold on, and found it charming. He could hear her trying to find something in the dark, clinking some things and bumping others, until he heard the rasp of a cigarette lighter's grind wheel and a spark dazzled him. He blinked at the bright purple blotch staining his vision, then averted his eyes from a small tongue of flame that appeared in front of him. Yellow light grew unsteadily and pushed back the darkness to gradually reveal a disappointing apartment. There were no tapestries and beautiful lamps and exquisite anything at all, and Rabbit felt like a jerk for half assuming that there would be, and for being unimpressed when there wasn't. It just did not go with the fantasy he'd created, but hey, this was real life, and in real life, he'd learned, people are poor and make do with what they can afford. He turned to face Shiraz with her old-fashioned lamp and smiled. "It's a palace," he said. She smiled and came forward with her hand held out, and he took it, expecting a kiss. But she turned and led him deeper into her home, pulling him along, the light from her lamp just barely illuminating their path. Then she let go of him and told him to wait for her another second. He stood in the dark for maybe less than a minute, but it felt like forever, hearing that rasp of the lighter's grind wheel again and again, and wondering what she was doing. Then he heard the low hiss of running water. When she reappeared with the lamp, she set it down on a small table he had not seen, smiling, and came in close to him. Her hands reached to cup his face lightly and pull it to her lips. And he caught fire from her kiss, every inch of his body trembling suddenly and tingling. He reached for her, but she broke away from him and backed up a step. "What is this?" he wanted to ask, to shout. "Give me some rope and yank it away?" She took his hand in both of hers and walked backwards, slowly pulling him along, and he felt like a bull being led by a string tied to the ring in its nose. She bumped the shadow of a door open with her rear end, and it swung open on a corridor of flickering orange light from 100 candles of all shapes and sizes along the walls. She'd scattered red rose petals along the floor before coming to get him at the train station, and his heart melted at the sight of it. She pulled him by his hand down the hall, smiling broadly at the look on his face as they crushed the petals beneath their feet, and bumped another door open with her rear end, pulling him into the bathroom. The bathroom? Oh! The hiss of water was the shower, and rose petals led the way to it. She'd known they would be in the hot sun all day, and that he would have to wash the residue of recycled air from the plane ride off of him, and had planned a romantic solution. His mind reeled. Never, ever in his life had a woman done something romantic for him. She let go of his hand and pulled his shirt up to his shoulders. He raised his arms to help her, and she lifted it off of him, chuckling at what she'd done to his hair, and then looking at his washboard stomach. He reached for her shirt to take it off, and she gave his hand a little slap, her Mona Lisa smile subtly curving her perfect lips. Her other hand lightly traced a pattern with her fingertips on his rippling chest and the abs that he clenched with all his might, raising goosebumps all over him. The feathery lightness of her touch made his breath come in shudders, and he reached for her shirt again, but she playfully slapped his hand away once more. So he stepped out of his shoes and kicked them away just to be doing something, instead of just standing awkwardly. Her fingertips traced their way to his belt and the tender skin behind it. And she let her hand fall to her side, the knuckle grazing his bulge on the way down. He jumped, and she laughed quietly at him, backing away to stick her hand in the shower and feel the warmth of the water. Nodding at the temperature, she started to come back and stopped. She reminded him in that moment of a cat that, when being let outside, stops in the doorway, looks around as if trying to decide if it wants to be outside, and then stretches just to make sure its master knows who the real master is. He remembered the way he had been led in the darkness, feeling like a tamed animal, and suddenly he knew that this was a test, and if he did not pass, the rest of his clothes were not coming off. He crossed the tiles and took her in his arms, crushing her lips with his, mashing them apart. She seemed relieved that he hadn't let her make him wait, and her tongue darted out as her arms went around his hard, tight waist. Her breath tasted like cardamom, and he realized she'd popped some in her mouth and chewed it while lighting the candles. He wished he'd had the opportunity to return the favor, but he had chewed all of his gum on the plane to keep his ears from hurting. She didn't seem to mind, though, kissing him with more passion than any American girl ever had. He tugged at her shirt, and this time she lifted up her arms to let him pull it off over her head, her lips returning fiercely to his. Her breast strained against him from behind her bra, and he left it on, not wanting to risk fumbling with it and looking bad. He pressed himself to her, and she ground her hips as she pulled him to her, with her into the shower, her fingers digging into the waist of his trousers. He kissed her throat, making her gasp, blowing his hands to massage the small of her back and set her tingling, and that was the magic button that made her stop kissing and struggle with his belt and the 2 buttons and zipper. Her hands shook so badly that she could barely get his belt undone, and when she found the 2nd button on the inside still holding him in, she growled in frustration. "Do you do up all the buttons? How many do you have?" Excuse me. He laughed and helped her with it, and she tugged his fly down to fish him out, her eyes widening at the size she hadn't expected. He'd gotten penis enlargement surgery almost a year before and couldn't get enough of girls' first reactions to it. Shiraz had to push his pants down to get it up out of them, and now held it with awe in both hands, looking up into his eyes in the dim light, and swallowed. "Hi," he said softly. "Hello," she whispered. "Who are you?" "Just some guy." She stepped out of her slippers and backed up, still holding him with both hands, pulling him with her into the shower with most of her clothes still on. She dragged him into the hot stream of water, reaching out behind her for the soap while he trod his wet trousers down around his ankles and kicked them away. She sank down onto her knees as he whispered a quiet prayer of "Thank you, God," while she lathered up her hands with the soap and began to stroke him, staring with hungry eyes. He swayed, reaching out to steady himself with one hand on the cold tiles, and she lathered up again and pressed the bar of soap into his other hand. He tried his best to wash himself without disturbing her, but he could barely stand anymore. Then she surprised him. Reaching up to take the bar from him again, she lifted him this way and that to get all the soap suds off of him, and lathered her hands up again, and slipped them around his back while kissing the dome of his penis lightly. He sagged, feeling her lips and tongue writhe against him as both of her soapy hands massaged his rear end, the fingers coming dangerously close to a place he was unaccustomed to having a woman touch. Slowly they came closer and moved away again, but then came closer still, and it scared him even more that he got longer and harder because of it. She was finding out something about him at the same time he was, and even in the darkness he could tell that she relished the feeling of power it gave her, knowing she made him nervous and knowing that he seemed to like it. Then she gave him a loud kiss on the tip and felt around in the shower floor for the soap, found it, and methodically cleaned his entire body, still wearing her soaking wet pants and bra, cleaning even between his toes. He stood awkwardly, swaying and letting her wash him as if she were his slave girl, until she stood before him, handing him the soap and watching his eyes as she unbuttoned her wet pants and wriggled them down. He strained his eyes to watch in the dim flickering light, but all he could see somehow were her eyes, the most beautiful eyes he'd ever seen. She kicked her wadded-up pants to the side of the shower and stood, her eyes still holding his, reached behind her back to unfasten her bra, and her breast came free before him. There was a kind of defiance in the way she stood then, as regal as a queen, her perfect body bare to him in all its glory. He had never in his life seen anything as wondrous. She lifted her chin to look down on him as if from a high throne and say, "Now it's your turn."